The snow fell harder than it had in decades, turning the Dakota Reservation into a frozen wasteland where survival meant making impossible choices. Sarah Whitehorse pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the Tribal Council building, watching her breath fog the glass as voices behind her sealed her fate. In 3 hours, she would be walking into a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back, cast out by the very people who once called her family. But what happened next in those mountains would change not just her life, but challenge everything anyone thought they knew about loyalty, redemption, and the true meaning of home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Pine Ridge Community Center buzzed with that familiar electrical hum that Sarah Whitehorse had grown to hate over the past 6 months. Every Tuesday evening, the same sound accompanied the same ritual of judgment, disappointment, and slowly diminishing hope. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight carried the weight of finality. Sarah sat in the back row of folding metal chairs, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Around her, members of the Lakota community she had called home for 32 years, whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low murmur that seemed to press against her from all sides. She didn't need to hear their words to know what they were saying. The story had spread like wildfire across the reservation over the past month, growing more distorted with each telling. At the front of the room, Elder Thomas Crowfeather adjusted his glasses and shuffled through a stack of papers. His weathered hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if he were buying time before delivering a verdict everyone already knew. To his right sat Council Chairman Robert Blackhorse, a man who had once bounced Sarah on his knee when she was small, who had taught her to braid sweetgrass and told her stories about their ancestors. Now he wouldn't meet her eyes. The events that led to this moment had unfolded with devastating swiftness. 3 months ago, Sarah had been the reservation's most promising young teacher, working at the elementary school and pursuing her master's degree in Indigenous Studies through night classes. She had plans to develop new curricula that would help preserve their language and traditions for future generations. The Tribal Council had even discussed sending her to a conference in Denver, an honor reserved for community members showing exceptional promise. Then, Marcus Sullivan arrived. Sullivan was a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles, claiming to be part Cherokee and interested in creating what he called an authentic portrayal of contemporary Native American life. He was charming, well-funded, and spoke passionately about giving Indigenous voices the platform they deserved. Sarah had been cautiously optimistic when the council assigned her to serve as his liaison, helping him navigate cultural sensitivities and connect with community members willing to participate. The warning signs had been subtle at first. Sullivan's questions seemed increasingly focused on poverty, addiction, and family dysfunction, rather than the resilience, innovation, and cultural richness Sarah tried to highlight. When she suggested featuring the new Solar Energy Initiative or the Language Immersion Program for toddlers, he would nod politely, but steer conversations back toward what he called the real struggles. Sarah's unease grew when she discovered Sullivan interviewing tribal members without her present, offering payment for what he termed raw, unfiltered testimonials. Teenagers talked about drug use and gang activity. Elders shared stories of historical trauma without proper context. Parents discussed financial hardships and unemployment rates. None of it was untrue, but Sullivan seemed determined to craft a narrative that reduced their community to a collection of social problems rather than a living, breathing culture with both challenges and extraordinary strengths. When Sarah confronted him about this approach, Sullivan's response revealed his true intentions. "Look, Sarah, I appreciate your passion for your people," he had said, the condescension dripping from every word. "But audiences want authenticity. They want to see the real impact of historical injustice. Sugarcoating it doesn't serve anyone. My film could bring national attention to issues that need addressing. Isn't that worth some uncomfortable truths? Sarah had tried to work within the system. She brought her concerns to Chairman Blackhorse, explaining that Sullivan's uncomfortable truths were actually harmful stereotypes disguised as documentary journalism. She provided examples of how his selective editing during preliminary interviews created misleading impressions. She even researched Sullivan's previous work and discovered a pattern of exploitative projects that had damaged other indigenous communities. The council listened politely, but ultimately chose to support Sullivan's project. The potential for national media attention and the promise of financial compensation for participants proved too attractive to resist. Sullivan had painted Sarah's objections as an attempt to control the narrative and suppress authentic voices within the community. Feeling increasingly isolated, Sarah made a decision that would ultimately destroy her standing in the community. She secretly recorded several conversations with Sullivan where he explicitly discussed manipulating footage to create more dramatic storylines and laughed about the noble, savage complex he planned to exploit. She also documented his inappropriate behavior toward younger women in the community and his casual dismissal of cultural protocols he had promised to respect. Sarah's intention was to present this evidence to the council as proof of Sullivan's duplicitous nature. Instead, her actions were discovered before she could make her case. Someone had seen her with the recording equipment and reported back to Sullivan, who immediately accused her of violating the confidentiality agreements he had established with the project. He claimed she was trying to sabotage the documentary because she couldn't control its content. The accusation of betrayal cut deep in a community where trust and loyalty were fundamental values. Sarah found herself having to defend not just her actions, but her motivations. Why had she been secretly recording conversations? Why hadn't she brought her concerns to the proper authorities sooner? Was she really trying to protect the community, or was she simply angry about being excluded from decision-making processes? What made the situation worse was that Sarah couldn't publicly share the most damaging recordings without potentially facing legal action from Sullivan's production company. The filmmaker had been careful to structure contracts and agreements in ways that protected his interests while limiting the community's recourse if they later objected to his methods. As weeks passed, Sarah watched helplessly as Sullivan continued his work, now with even more community support, because his narrative of persecution by political correctness resonated with some tribal members who felt outsiders constantly judged their choices. Sarah's attempts to explain her position were increasingly seen as excuses, and her isolation grew more complete with each passing day. The breaking point came when Sarah's teenage nephew, David Whitehorse, appeared in one of Sullivan's preliminary video segments. The footage showed David discussing his struggles with depression and his father's alcoholism in raw, emotional detail. Sullivan had filmed the interview when David was particularly vulnerable, having just learned that his college scholarship application had been rejected. The segment portrayed David's pain without context, reducing an intelligent, complex young man to a symbol of generational trauma. Sarah's sister, David's mother, was devastated. She blamed Sarah for bringing Sullivan into their lives and for failing to protect her son from exploitation. But the family members took sides, and suddenly Sarah found herself cut off from relatives who had been her closest allies. Elder Crowfeather cleared his throat, bringing Sarah's attention back to the present moment. The community center had grown quiet, and all eyes were fixed on the front of the room. Sarah's stomach tightened as she realized the time for reflection had ended. Sarah Whitehorse, Elder Crowfeather's voice carried the weight of tradition and authority. You have been asked to appear before this council to account for your actions regarding the Sullivan documentary project and the division your choices have created within our community. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the eyes of every person in the room, tracking her movement. Some faces showed disappointment, others anger, and a few reflected what might have been sympathy. But even the sympathetic faces were closed off, as if their owners had already decided this was a tragedy with only one possible ending. The evidence presented to this council shows that you violated trust agreements, engaged in deceptive practices, and prioritized your personal judgment over the collective decision-making process of our community values, Crowfeather continued. Your actions have created conflict among families and undermined a project that many community members supported. Sarah wanted to speak, to explain once more that everything she had done was motivated by love for her people and fear of how Sullivan's documentary would represent them to the world. But she had already made her case in previous meetings, and the words had fallen on ears that seemed determined not to hear. However, Crowfeather paused, his weathered face showing the weight of what came next. We also acknowledge that your intentions may have been guided by concern for our community's well-being. This makes your actions more complicated than simple betrayal, but no less damaging to our unity. The elder's words carried an odd mixture of understanding and condemnation that somehow felt worse than outright rejection would have been. Sarah realized that being seen as well-intentioned but destructive was perhaps more isolating than being viewed as malicious. Chairman Blackhorse finally looked directly at Sarah for the first time in weeks. His expression was painful but resolute. The council has discussed this matter extensively. We believe the best path forward requires time and distance for healing. Sarah Whitehorse, you are asked to leave Pine Ridge and not return until the community is ready to consider reconciliation. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Banishment was not a decision the council made lightly or frequently. It represented a complete severing of ties with the community that had shaped her identity and purpose. She would lose her job, her home, her daily connections with family and friends, and her sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The council recognizes this is a severe action, Blackhorse continued, his voice carefully controlled. But the divisions in our community require dramatic healing. Your presence, regardless of your intentions, continues to remind people of conflicts we need to resolve. Sometimes love requires sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice means stepping away so others can move forward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah felt tears beginning to build behind her eyes. But she refused to let them fall in this room, in front of these people who were cutting her loose like a frayed rope that threatened to unravel everything else. She had cried enough in private over the past months. This moment demanded dignity, even in defeat. You have until Friday to make arrangements, Blackhorse added. After that, you will no longer be welcome on Pine Ridge land. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to pack up a lifetime. To say goodbye to a place that had been her entire world, to figure out how to exist as Sarah Whitehorse without the community that had created and defined that identity. As the council members filed out of the community center, Sarah remained standing in the same spot, feeling simultaneously frozen and unmoored. A few people approached her with awkward words of sympathy or regret, but their attempts at comfort felt hollow. They were staying. She was leaving. The mathematics of that situation rendered everything else meaningless. Outside, the first snowflakes of what weather reports promised would be a significant storm were beginning to fall. Sarah walked to her truck, her footsteps crunching on ground that was already hardening with frost. The reservation stretched around her in all directions, a familiar landscape that would soon become forbidden territory. She had 3 days to figure out where someone went when they could no longer be who they had always been. 3 days to transform from Sarah Whitehorse of Pine Ridge into Sarah Whitehorse of nowhere, belonging to no one, responsible only to herself in ways she had never had to consider. The snow was falling harder by the time she reached her small house near the school. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had that morning, when she still harbored some small hope that the council might find a way to let her stay. Now these familiar objects, the books on indigenous education, the photographs of students and family, the traditional star quilt her grandmother had made, felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Sarah made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the storm that seemed to be intensifying with each passing hour. The weather service had issued warnings about dangerous travel conditions and potential power outages. It seemed fitting that her exile would begin with a blizzard, as if even nature was conspiring to make her departure as difficult as possible. She began making lists, things to pack, people to notify, arrangements to finalize. But the practical aspects of leaving felt surreal and disconnected from the emotional reality of what was happening. How did someone pack up their entire identity? What did you take when everything that mattered most couldn't fit in boxes? By Thursday evening, Sarah had managed to organize her belongings and secure a storage unit in Rapid City for items she couldn't immediately transport. She had withdrawn her savings, cancelled utilities, and written letters to family members she might not see again for years. The mechanical aspects of departure were falling into place, but she still had no clear destination. Several former colleagues had offered temporary housing in other cities, but Sarah found herself reluctant to accept help that felt like charity. She needed to figure out how to rebuild her life on her own terms, not as someone else's project or burden. The irony of that decision wasn't lost on her. After fighting so hard against being defined by others' narratives, she was determined to write her own story of exile and potential redemption. The storm that had been threatening all week arrived with full force on Friday morning. Sarah woke to find her house surrounded by wind and snow so intense that she could barely see her truck parked 20 feet away. The blizzard had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous, where even short distances became potentially life-threatening journeys. Despite the conditions, Sarah knew she couldn't delay her departure. The council's deadline was today, and she had already pushed against their authority enough to last several lifetimes. She loaded her truck with essential belongings, leaving behind furniture and larger items she couldn't transport safely in the storm. As she prepared to drive away from Pine Ridge for what might be the last time, Sarah realized she'd been so focused on the mechanics of leaving that she hadn't properly considered where she was going. The storm made travel dangerous in any direction, but staying was no longer an option. She pointed her truck toward the Badlands, figuring she would drive until the weather or her fuel forced a decision about destination. The roads were treacherous, with visibility reduced to mere yards, and snow accumulating faster than plows could clear it. Several times, Sarah questioned whether she should turn back, but each time she remembered that there was no longer anywhere to return to. The storm seemed to be pushing her away from everything familiar, deeper into territory she had rarely explored, despite living her entire life in the region. The Badlands gave way to the Black Hills, and still the snow continued falling with relentless intensity. As afternoon light began fading into early winter darkness, Sarah realized she was genuinely lost. The storm had erased familiar landmarks, and her truck was struggling in the deepening snow. Her fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and she hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Fear began creeping in around the edges of her determination. Being cast out by her community was one thing, but dying alone in a blizzard because of pride and stubbornness was quite another. Sarah started watching more carefully for any signs of shelter or assistance, but the landscape revealed nothing but endless snow and gathering darkness. Just as panic was beginning to take hold, Sarah noticed a faint glow through the storm ahead. It took several more minutes of careful driving to determine that the light was coming from windows, indicating some kind of structure. As she drew closer, she could make out the outline of a substantial log building. With smoke rising from what appeared to be multiple chimneys, Sarah pulled her truck as close to the building as possible and sat for a moment, gathering courage to venture into the storm for the short walk to what she hoped would be shelter. The wind was howling with such intensity that opening the truck door required significant effort. And the cold hit her like a physical assault. She grabbed her overnight bag and struggled through the snow toward the building's front door, the wind threatening to knock her down with each step. By the time she reached the covered porch, her face was numb and her hands could barely function well enough to knock on the heavy wooden door. The person who answered was not what Sarah had expected to find in this remote location during a blizzard. A woman about her own age stood in the doorway with long dark hair and features that suggested she might also be Native American, though from a different tribal background. Her expression showed concern rather than suspicion as she took in Sarah's snow-covered, desperate appearance. "Come in," the woman said immediately, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. "You shouldn't be traveling in this storm." Sarah stumbled into a warm, welcoming space that felt like stepping into another world entirely. The interior of the building was rustic but comfortable, with exposed log beams and a massive stone fireplace where a substantial fire crackled and danced. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something that might have been homemade bread. The warmth hit Sarah like a gentle embrace after the brutal assault of the blizzard. She stood dripping melted snow onto a hand-woven rug, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as circulation slowly returned to her extremities. The woman who had opened the door was already moving with practiced efficiency, hanging up Sarah's soaked coat and guiding her toward the massive fireplace. "I'm Elena Riversong," the woman said, wrapping a thick wool blanket around Sarah's shoulders. "And you're hypothermic. We need to get your core temperature up before we worry about anything else." Sarah tried to respond, but her jaw was clenched too tightly from shivering to form coherent words. Elena disappeared into what appeared to be a kitchen area and returned moments later with a steaming mug that smelled of ginger and honey. "Small sips," Elena instructed. "Your stomach needs to adjust gradually." As feeling returned to Sarah's hands and face, she began taking in her surroundings more clearly. The building was larger than it had appeared from outside, with an open floor plan that seemed to serve multiple purposes. What looked like a living area near the fireplace flowed seamlessly into a dining space, which connected to the kitchen where Eleanor had prepared the warm drink. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on everything from sustainable agriculture to traditional medicine. Native American artwork decorated the space, but not in the tourist-friendly way Sarah was accustomed to seeing. These pieces looked authentic, personal, chosen by someone who understood their cultural significance. "Where am I?" Sarah finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse from the cold. "About 15 miles northwest of Hill City," Elena replied, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "This is the Mountain Heart community. We're a collective of families who've been living off-grid here for about 8 years now." Sarah had heard vague rumors about intentional communities in the Black Hills, but she had never encountered anyone who actually lived in one. The concept seemed both appealing and slightly impractical to her reservation-raised sensibilities. How did people survive in such isolation, especially during harsh winters like this one? "You're Cherokee," Sarah observed, recognizing certain features and inflections she had encountered during college. Elena nodded. "Cherokee and Lakota, actually. My grandmother was from Pine Ridge originally, but she married a Cherokee man and moved to Oklahoma. I grew up there, but always felt pulled back to this region. What about you?" "Lakota, from Pine Ridge," Sarah answered, then hesitated. "Well, formerly from Pine Ridge, I guess." Something in Sarah's tone must have conveyed the weight behind those words, because Elena's expression shifted to one of deeper attention. She didn't push for details, but her silence invited explanation in a way that felt safe rather than intrusive. Over the next hour, as the storm continued raging outside and Sarah's body temperature normalized, she found herself telling Elena the entire story. Starting with Marcus Sullivan's arrival at the reservation and ending with her departure that morning, Sarah laid out the sequence of events that had led to her exile. Elena listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding, but never offering premature judgments or advice. So you tried to protect your community from exploitation and ended up being punished for it, Elena summarized when Sarah finished. That's unfortunately not an uncommon story in Indian country. Sarah was surprised by how much relief she felt at having her situation understood so quickly and without judgment. For months, she had been defending her choices to people who seemed determined to misunderstand her motivations. Elena's immediate grasp of the fundamental dynamics felt like a gift. The question now, Elena continued, is what you want to do next. The storm is supposed to last at least 2 more days, so you're not going anywhere immediately. But beyond that, do you have any sense of where you want to rebuild your life? The honest answer was that Sarah had no idea. She had been so focused on leaving Pine Ridge that she hadn't given serious thought to what came after departure. The assumption had been that she would figure it out once she was away, but now that moment had arrived and she felt completely unmoored. I don't know, Sarah admitted. Everything I am, everything I've ever been, was tied to Pine Ridge. I don't know how to be Sarah Whitehorse without that community. Elena stood and moved to a window, peering out at the storm that showed no signs of abating. Identity is a funny thing, she said thoughtfully. We think it's fixed, determined by where we come from and who raised us. But sometimes, losing those external anchors forces us to discover parts of ourselves we never knew existed. Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened and 2 people entered, shaking snow from their heavy coats and boots. One was a tall man with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. The other a younger woman with short black hair and paint-stained fingers. Elena, the generator building is secure, but we lost power to the workshop, the man announced. Then noticed Sarah sitting by the fire. His expression shifted to one of concern and curiosity. This is Sarah, Elena explained. She got caught in the storm and needed shelter. Sarah, meet my partner Daniel Morningstar and our housemate Rebecca Chen. Daniel immediately extended his hand to Sarah with a warm smile. Welcome. Rough night to be traveling, but you found the right place for refuge. Rebecca nodded in greeting, but seemed more focused on practical concerns. How's your truck handling the snow? We might need to dig it out once the storm passes. Sarah appreciated both the genuine welcome and the assumption that her vehicle situation would be addressed. These people seemed to operate with an automatic hospitality that reminded her of the best aspects of reservation life, but without the complicated family politics and tribal hierarchies that had ultimately led to her exile. Your truck should be fine where it is, Daniel continued, settling into another chair near the fire. We'll get you dug out when this weather breaks. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The casualness of the offer struck Sarah as remarkable. These people had known her for less than 2 hours, yet they were extending open-ended hospitality without apparent concern about burden or inconvenience. It was both touching and slightly overwhelming for someone accustomed to operating within complex networks of obligation and reciprocity. I can pay for room and board, Sarah offered. I don't want to impose. Rebecca laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. We don't really operate on a cash economy here. If you stay for any extended period, you'd contribute labor instead of money. But right now, you're a traveler in need of shelter during a dangerous storm. Basic human decency doesn't require payment. As if to punctuate her words, the wind gusted with renewed fury, rattling windows and sending sparks up the chimney. The storm seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing, which meant Sarah would likely be here at least through the weekend. Daniel disappeared into the kitchen and returned with bowls of soup that tasted like it had been simmering for hours. The bread Elena had been baking earlier emerged from the oven, filling the space with an aroma that made Sarah realize she hadn't eaten since early morning. The simple act of sharing a meal with these strangers felt more nourishing than just the food itself. So what exactly is the Mountain Heart community? Sarah asked, between spoonfuls of soup that tasted like vegetables she couldn't identify, but which were clearly grown with care. It started as a way for indigenous people to live more sustainably and maintain cultural practices, without dealing with some of the challenges that come with reservation life, Daniel explained. Not that we're anti-reservation or anything like that. But some of us needed a different kind of community structure. Rebecca picked up the explanation. We have about 30 people living here year-round, in 6 different family units. Everyone contributes according to their skills and abilities. Some folks farm, others handle construction and maintenance, some focus on traditional crafts or modern technology. We share resources and decision-making. But we're not trying to recreate some idealized vision of pre-contact life. It's more like we're trying to figure out how to be indigenous in the 21st century while maintaining some control over our environment and community relationships, Elena added. Sarah found the concept intriguing but also somewhat skeptical. Intentional communities had a reputation for falling apart due to personality conflicts and unrealistic expectations. How did 30 people with different backgrounds and needs manage to cooperate effectively in such an isolated setting? What about disagreements? She asked. How do you handle conflicts when people can't just go home to separate houses and avoid each other? Daniel grinned, very carefully. We spent the first 2 years here learning how to argue constructively and make decisions collectively. It's an ongoing process, and we've definitely had people leave when they realized this lifestyle wasn't for them. But the folks who stay tend to be pretty committed to making it work. We also have structured ways of addressing conflicts before they become community-threatening, Rebecca explained. Monthly community meetings, mediation processes, even temporary separation arrangements when people need space. It's not perfect, but it's more intentional than most places. The conversation continued throughout the evening, moving from practical aspects of community living to broader philosophical questions about identity, belonging, and what it meant to live authentically as Native people in contemporary America. Sarah found herself more engaged than she had been in months, her mind working through ideas and possibilities she had never seriously considered. Elena showed Sarah to a small but comfortable guest room around 10 o'clock, explaining that the community maintained space for visitors and travelers who might need temporary shelter. The room contained a single bed with handmade quilts, a small desk, and a bookshelf filled with titles on indigenous history, sustainable living, and spiritual practices. The bathroom is just down the hall, Elena explained. Hot water comes from our solar system, so it's best to shower in the afternoon when the batteries are fully charged. But there's always enough for basic needs. Sarah settled into bed, listening to the storm continue its assault on the building. Despite the intensity of the weather outside, she felt safer than she had in months. The solid construction of the log building and the warmth from the central heating system created a cocoon of security that allowed her mind to finally relax. For the first time since the documentary crisis began, Sarah fell asleep without reviewing every decision she had made or imagining different outcomes to conversations and confrontations. The exhaustion of emotional trauma, combined with physical stress from the storm, created a depth of rest she hadn't experienced in far too long. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of muted conversations from the main living area. Sunlight was streaming through her window, suggesting the storm had finally passed, but when she looked outside, she saw snow piled nearly to the windowsill. The landscape had been completely transformed overnight, turning the familiar Black Hills terrain into something that looked almost alien in its pristine whiteness. Sarah dressed and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Elena and Daniel preparing breakfast, while Rebecca worked on what appeared to be some kind of technical drawing at the dining table. "Good morning," Elena greeted her with a smile.
"How did you sleep?"
"Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, accepting a cup of coffee that tasted remarkably good for being made in such a remote location. Daniel looked up from the stove where he was preparing eggs. The storm dropped about 3 feet of snow, but it's supposed to be clear and sunny for the next few days. Perfect conditions for digging out and getting things back to normal. Rebecca glanced up from her work. Your truck is completely buried, but it's not going anywhere dangerous. We'll get a crew together this afternoon to dig out all the vehicles. Sarah appreciated the matter-of-fact way they addressed her situation. There was no drama or excessive concern, just practical problem-solving and an assumption that community members helped each other deal with difficulties. After breakfast, Elena offered to show Sarah around the community. The bright sunshine made the snow-covered landscape spectacular, with the Black Hills rising dramatically around them and every tree branch outlined in pristine white. The buildings of Mountain Heart Community were scattered across several acres, connected by paths that were now marked only by slight depressions in the snow. That's the workshop where Rebecca does metalworking and Daniel handles woodworking projects. Elena pointed to a substantial building with solar panels covering most of its roof. The greenhouse complex is over there, though you can't see much of it under the snow. We grow most of our own vegetables year-round. They walked past a building Eleanor identified as the school, where community children received both conventional education and instruction in traditional skills and cultural knowledge. Another structure housed the community's library and meeting space, while a third contained what Elena described as the healing center, where both modern medical care and traditional medicine were practiced. How do you handle serious medical emergencies? Sarah asked, thinking about the isolation and the difficulty of getting to conventional hospitals in conditions like the current snow. We have a couple of community members with EMT and nursing training, Elena explained, plus a satellite phone and arrangements with emergency services for helicopter evacuation if necessary. It's more complex than living in town, but not as dangerous as it might seem. As they made their way back toward the main house, Sarah noticed other community members beginning to emerge from their homes, organizing snow removal efforts and checking on animal shelters and infrastructure. The level of coordination and mutual support impressed her, especially considering these people weren't bound together by blood relationships or traditional tribal structures. Elena, Sarah said as they reached the front porch, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Why did you leave Oklahoma to come here? What made you think this kind of community was worth the risk and difficulty? Elena paused before answering, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. I spent my 20s trying to succeed in mainstream American society. College, corporate job, apartment in Tulsa, all the markers of success according to dominant culture. But I felt disconnected from everything that mattered to me. My Cherokee identity became something I performed occasionally rather than something I lived. She gestured toward the snow-covered community around them. Here, being indigenous isn't something I have to compartmentalize or explain to others. It's integrated into daily life in ways that feel natural rather than forced. I can practice traditional skills alongside modern technology, make decisions collectively rather than competitively, and live in closer harmony with the land. Sarah understood exactly what Elena meant. Even on the reservation, there had always been tension between traditional values and contemporary necessities, between tribal identity and individual advancement. The idea of a community where those conflicts might be minimized or resolved differently was appealing. But don't you miss being part of a larger tribal community? Sarah asked. Don't you feel isolated from Cherokee culture by being so far from Oklahoma? Elena smiled. Culture isn't just about geography. We have Cherokee people visit here regularly, and we maintain connections to communities in Oklahoma and North Carolina. But we've also built relationships with Lakota families and other tribal groups in this region. Identity can be more fluid than we sometimes think. That afternoon, true to Rebecca's prediction, a group of community members assembled to dig out vehicles buried by the storm. Sarah found herself working alongside people she had never met before, but who treated her participation as natural and expected rather than surprising. The work was hard but satisfying, and the conversations that flowed around shared labor felt familiar and comfortable. By evening, Sarah's truck was accessible, and several community members had checked it over to ensure it hadn't suffered any damage from the storm. The engine started without difficulty, and the vehicle appeared to have weathered the blizzard better than Sarah herself had. "So," Daniel asked over dinner, "are you planning to continue traveling tomorrow? Or would you like to stay a few more days and learn more about what we do here?" The question forced Sarah to confront a decision she had been avoiding. Her original plan had been to drive somewhere warmer and start over in a place where no one knew her story. But the past 2 days at Mountain Heart had shown her possibilities she hadn't considered. "I'd like to stay a little longer if that's okay," she said. "I'm curious about how this all works, and I'm not sure I'm ready to face the outside world yet." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Elena assured her. "We've had people visit for a few days and end up staying for years. We've also had people stay for months and then decide this lifestyle wasn't for them. There's no pressure either way." That evening, Sarah called her sister from the community's phone to let her know she was safe. The conversation was awkward and brief, with both women struggling to navigate their new relationship dynamic. Sarah's sister seemed relieved to know she had found shelter, but uncertain about how to maintain connection, given the circumstances of Sarah's departure from Pine Ridge. After the phone call, Sarah sat by the fire in the main house, reading one of the books from Elena's shelf about contemporary indigenous identity and sovereignty. The ideas in the book resonated with questions she had been grappling with for months, about what it meant to be Native American in a world that seemed determined to define indigenous people according to its own needs and prejudices. This year, Marcus Sullivan documentary crisis had forced Sarah to confront how easily outsiders could manipulate and exploit indigenous communities. But her time at Mountain Heart was showing her different possibilities for maintaining cultural identity while exercising greater control over external influences. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah realized she felt more hopeful than she had since the entire conflict began. The community had offered her something she hadn't expected to find, a sense of belonging that didn't require her to surrender her autonomy or compromise her values. Tomorrow, she would begin learning more about how Mountain Heart community actually functioned, and whether the sense of possibility she was feeling might translate into a genuine new beginning. Sarah's third morning at Mountain Heart began with an unexpected visitor. She was helping Elena prepare breakfast when a knock at the door interrupted their conversation about seasonal food preservation techniques. Daniel answered and stepped aside to admit a woman Sarah recognized immediately, despite not having seen her in over 15 years. "Margaret Stormcloud," the visitor announced herself. Though introductions were hardly necessary, Margaret had been a year ahead of Sarah in high school and had gone on to become one of the most respected educators in the region, working with multiple tribal communities on curriculum development and cultural preservation programs. "Sarah Whitehorse," Margaret said, her tone carefully neutral. "I heard you might be in this area." The weight of that statement hung heavy in the room. News traveled fast in Native communities, and Sarah realized her exile from Pine Ridge was likely already known throughout the regional indigenous network. Margaret's presence here couldn't be coincidental. "Margaret teaches at our community school twice a week," Elena explained, her voice carrying subtle protective undertones. "She drives up from Rapid City to work with our kids on Lakota language and history." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. After days of feeling accepted and welcomed at Mountain Heart, the arrival of someone from her past threatened to shatter the fragile sense of safety she had been building. Margaret's reputation was formidable, and her opinion carried significant weight in educational circles throughout the region. "Could I speak with Sarah privately?" Margaret asked, her expression giving no indication of her intentions. Elena and Daniel exchanged glances before Elena nodded toward a small sitting area adjacent to the kitchen. "Of course." Sarah, take as much time as you need. The two women settled into chairs facing each other, and for a long moment neither spoke. Margaret studied Sarah's face with the intensity she was known for bringing to complex problems, while Sarah fought the urge to launch into defensive explanations of her recent choices. "I've been following the situation with the Sullivan documentary," Margaret finally said. "I've also been hearing different versions of what happened from various sources." Sarah braced herself for judgment or criticism, but Margaret's next words surprised her. "I think you were right to try to stop him." The simple statement hit Sarah like an unexpected gift. For months, she'd been defending her actions to people who seemed determined to misunderstand her motivations. Having someone with Margaret's credibility validate her position felt like a profound relief. "Unfortunately, being right and being effective are two different things," Margaret continued. "Your approach created more problems than it solved, but your instincts about Sullivan were accurate." Sarah waited for the inevitable but that would undermine this validation. "I spent some time researching his previous work after hearing about the Pine Ridge Project," Margaret explained. "His documentary on the Seminole community in Florida was exactly the kind of exploitative poverty porn you were worried about. He follows a consistent pattern of extracting trauma stories without providing proper context or community benefit." "Then why didn't the council listen when I tried to present evidence?" Sarah asked, frustration bleeding through her carefully controlled tone. "Because you handled it like an individual rather than building collective support," Margaret replied bluntly. "You gathered information secretly, made unilateral decisions about what evidence to present, and tried to convince the council through argument rather than consensus building. Your tactics reinforced the narrative that you were trying to control the situation rather than serve the community." The criticism stung because Sarah recognized its accuracy. She had approached the Sullivan problem as if it were an academic debate where the strongest argument would prevail, rather than understanding it as a community issue requiring relationship building and collaborative problem solving. "What should I have done differently?" Sarah asked, genuinely wanting to learn from her mistakes. "Build alliances before taking action. Identified other community members who shared your concerns and worked with them to address the council collectively. Found ways to give Sullivan enough rope to hang himself publicly rather than trying to expose him through secret recordings. Focused on community values and collective decision-making rather than individual expertise and judgment." Margaret's analysis was thorough and devastating in its accuracy. Sarah could see exactly how different strategies might have produced better outcomes, but that knowledge felt useless now that the damage was done. "The question is what you do next," Margaret continued. "You have skills and knowledge that indigenous communities need. The Pine Ridge situation doesn't have to define the rest of your career or your contribution to our people." Sarah looked around the comfortable room where Eleanor and Daniel were giving them privacy. Considering the unexpected sense of belonging she had begun developing at Mountain Heart, "I'm not sure I want to go back to formal education," Sarah admitted. "The politics and bureaucracy, the constant battles over resources and approaches. Maybe I need to find a different way to contribute." Margaret followed her gaze, taking in the community building's blend of traditional and modern elements. The evidence of cooperative living and shared resources. "This place is interesting," Margaret acknowledged. "Elena tells me they're developing some innovative approaches to indigenous education that don't rely on conventional institutional structures." Before Sarah could respond, Margaret stood and moved to the window overlooking the snow-covered community grounds. "Actually, that's part of why I wanted to talk with you. Mountain Heart has been asking for help developing a more comprehensive educational program for their kids. Something that would meet state requirements while preserving cultural focus and alternative pedagogical approaches. They need someone with your background in curriculum development and indigenous studies." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The possibility of meaningful work that aligned with her values and expertise was exactly what she hadn't dared to hope for. "They haven't formally offered me anything," Sarah said carefully, "because they're respectful enough not to recruit someone who's dealing with recent trauma and major life transitions," Margaret replied. "But Elena asked me to sound out your interest and availability." The conversation continued for another hour, with Margaret providing details about Mountain Heart's educational vision and the challenges they faced in creating programming that served both their community values and legal requirements for homeschooling cooperatives. Sarah found herself increasingly excited about possibilities she hadn't considered. When Margaret finally prepared to leave, she paused at the door with one final observation. "Sarah, what happened at Pine Ridge was painful, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Communities change, people forgive, and sometimes exile creates opportunities for growth that staying would never have provided. Don't close any doors you might want to walk through later." After Margaret's departure, Sarah spent the rest of the morning helping with community maintenance tasks while processing the conversation. The validation of her concerns about the documentary felt healing, but the criticism of her methods was harder to integrate. She had always prided herself on being smart and principled, but Margaret's analysis showed how those qualities could become liabilities without proper social and political skills. That afternoon, Elena approached her about visiting the community school to observe their current educational programming. "No pressure," Elena emphasized. "Margaret mentioned you might be interested in learning more about what we're doing, but I don't want you to feel like we're pushing you toward any commitments." The school building was smaller than Sarah had expected, but efficiently designed to serve multiple age groups and learning styles. 2 large rooms could be divided by movable partitions to create different configurations, while a third space served as a library and computer lab. The afternoon session included 8 children, ranging in age from 6 to 15, working on projects that seemed to integrate traditional knowledge with contemporary academic subjects. Sarah watched a 10-year-old girl named Jennifer demonstrate plant identification and medicinal uses while simultaneously practicing fraction calculations based on traditional recipes. 2 teenage boys were collaborating on a history project that traced their families' migrations and land relationships using both oral traditions and archival research methods. "It's not perfect," Elena admitted as they observed the children working. "We're constantly balancing individual learning needs with community resources, and we struggle with advanced math and science for the older kids. But the integrated approach seems to produce young people who are both culturally grounded and academically prepared." Sarah could see the potential and the challenges. The community had created something unique and valuable, but they needed more sophisticated curriculum development and assessment strategies to ensure their students could transition successfully to higher education or other career paths. If they chose to leave the community, what kind of support would be most helpful? Sarah asked, honestly. "Someone who understands both indigenous pedagogical approaches and mainstream educational requirements well enough to help us develop systematic programming, rather than the somewhat improvisational approach we're using now." That evening, Sarah joined the community's weekly planning meeting, where residents discussed upcoming projects, resource allocation, and decision-making processes. The meeting was facilitated by an older man named Joseph Bearcloud, who managed to keep discussions focused while ensuring everyone had opportunities to contribute. Sarah was struck by how different the group dynamics were from tribal council meetings she had attended. There was less posturing and more genuine listening, fewer predetermined positions, and more collaborative problem-solving. When disagreements arose, they were addressed through structured dialogue rather than debate or argumentation. "We're facing some challenges with our educational programming," Elena reported during the meeting. "The state is requiring more documentation of learning outcomes, And we need to make sure our older students are adequately prepared for standardized tests if they decide to pursue conventional higher education. Joseph nodded thoughtfully. What kind of resources would address those needs? Ideally, someone with curriculum development experience who could work with our existing teachers to create more systematic approaches while preserving our cultural focus and community values. Elena replied. Sarah felt multiple pairs of eyes turn toward her, though no one made the connection explicit. The community's approach to decision-making seemed to involve allowing possibilities to emerge naturally rather than pushing for immediate commitments. I might be able to help with that, Sarah said carefully. I have a background in Indigenous Studies curriculum development, and I'm looking for meaningful work that aligns with my values. The conversation that followed was unlike any job interview Sarah had ever experienced. Instead of focusing on her qualifications and their needs, the discussion centered on how educational programming served community goals and what kind of collaborative relationship would benefit everyone involved. By the end of the meeting, Sarah had agreed to spend the following weeks observing their educational approaches, identifying areas for improvement, and developing recommendations for more systematic programming. The arrangement wasn't a formal job offer, but it was meaningful work that could potentially develop into something more permanent. Over the next several days, Sarah immersed herself in understanding Mountain Heart's educational philosophy and practice. She observed classes, interviewed teachers and students, and reviewed examples of student work and assessment methods. What she discovered was a community that had intuitively developed many best practices for Indigenous education, but lacked the systematic framework needed to scale and sustain their approaches. The children were clearly engaged in learning, but the educational programming depended heavily on individual teacher initiative rather than coherent curriculum design. Students were culturally grounded and intellectually curious, but their preparation for standardized assessments was inconsistent. The integration of traditional knowledge with contemporary academic subjects was innovative but needed more. Sophisticated pedagogical structure. Sarah began developing detailed recommendations for curriculum improvement, assessment strategies, and teacher professional development. The work felt more meaningful than any project she had undertaken in years, combining her expertise with community needs in ways that could produce genuine benefit. One evening, as she worked on a proposal for an integrated science and traditional ecological knowledge curriculum, Elena joined her at the dining table where she had spread out her materials. "You look happier than I've seen you since you arrived," Elena observed. Sarah paused in her writing to consider the accuracy of that statement. She did feel more engaged and purposeful than she had in months, possibly years. The work was challenging but aligned with her values, and the collaborative relationship with community members felt more satisfying than the hierarchical structures she was accustomed to navigating. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about discovering parts of yourself you never knew existed," Sarah replied. "Does that mean you're considering staying longer term?" Sarah had been avoiding that question, but Elena's direct approach demanded an honest response. "I'm scared to make another major commitment so soon after everything fell apart at Pine Ridge," Sarah admitted. "But this work feels right in ways I haven't experienced before." Elena nodded understandingly. "What if we approached it differently? Instead of thinking about permanent commitment, what if you considered this an extended experiment? Stay for a year, develop educational programming, see how it feels to live and work here. At the end of the year, reassess whether you want to make it more permanent." The suggestion felt manageable in ways that permanent commitment did not. Sarah could imagine dedicating a year to meaningful work while maintaining the option to reconsider her choices based on actual experience rather than theoretical possibilities. "That might work," Sarah said slowly. "But I'd want to contribute more than just educational programming. I'd want to be a real community member, not just a consultant who happens to live here. We'd want that too, Eleanor assured her. Consultants don't make the community stronger. Members do. That night, Sarah called her sister again to explain her tentative plans. The conversation was easier than their previous exchange, though still complicated by the unresolved hurt and disappointment surrounding her departure from Pine Ridge. Are you sure this isn't just running away from your problems? Her sister asked bluntly. Maybe it is, Sarah admitted. But maybe sometimes running away from one set of problems leads you toward better solutions. I can't undo what happened at Pine Ridge, but I can choose what I do next. Just don't disappear completely, her sister requested. You're still family, even if you can't come home right now. The phone call left Sarah feeling both melancholy about what she had lost and hopeful about what she might be building. The past month had taught her that identity and belonging could be more fluid than she had previously understood, and that sometimes the most important growth happened outside familiar structures and relationships. As winter began giving way to early spring, Sarah formally accepted Elena's proposal for a year-long arrangement. She would develop comprehensive educational programming for Mountain Heart community while learning what it meant to live cooperatively and sustainably. At the end of the year, she would decide whether to make the arrangement permanent. The decision felt both significant and provisional, a commitment to exploration rather than a final answer about her future. But for the first time since the documentary crisis began, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something positive rather than simply away from something painful. Spring arrived at Mountain Heart community with the kind of dramatic transformation that only mountain regions can produce. In the span of 2 weeks, Sarah watched the landscape shift from snow-covered stillness to explosive green growth, as if the earth itself was celebrating its liberation from winter's grip. She had been living in the community for nearly 3 months now, long enough to establish routines, but not quite long enough to take the breathtaking scenery for granted. The educational program she had been developing was entering its implementation phase, and Sarah found herself managing complexities she hadn't anticipated. Working with children who had never experienced traditional classroom structures required approaches that went far beyond conventional curriculum design. These kids were accustomed to learning through observation, hands-on experience, and collaborative exploration rather than lecture-based instruction or individual competition. 8-year-old Marcus Thunderheart exemplified both the promise and the challenges of the community's educational approach. Brilliant and curious, he could identify dozens of plant species and explain their medicinal uses. But he struggled with basic multiplication because he had never been required to memorize abstract number relationships. 15-year-old Amy Crow Feather could weave traditional baskets with exceptional skill and understood complex ecological relationships. But she panicked when faced with standardized test questions that required selecting single correct answers from multiple choices. Sarah was discovering that developing truly integrated Indigenous education meant more than simply adding cultural content to conventional subjects. It required fundamentally rethinking how learning happened, what knowledge was valued, and how student progress should be assessed. We're trying to prepare these kids for a world that doesn't understand or value what they know, Sarah explained to Elena one evening as they reviewed student portfolios. But we also can't isolate them from mainstream expectations if they choose to pursue conventional higher education or careers. Elena nodded, her expression reflecting similar concerns. Some of our first graduates are starting to face these challenges now. Jenny Blackbear got accepted to Colorado State University, but she's struggling with the competitive academic environment and the disconnect between her learning style and university expectations. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Daniel answered and admitted a man Sarah didn't recognize, though his expensive clothing and confident demeanor immediately marked him as an outsider to the community. "I'm looking for Sarah Whitehorse," the man announced without introducing himself. I understand she's been staying here. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she recognized the voice. Though she hadn't seen the speaker in nearly a year, Dr. Richard Ashworth had been her graduate advisor and the person who had initially recommended her for the liaison position with Marcus Sullivan's documentary project. I'm Sarah, she acknowledged, standing to face her unexpected visitor. Dr. Ashworth's presence at Mountain Heart felt like a collision between her past and present lives, bringing with it all the complicated emotions she had been trying to process through her work and community integration. Sarah, we need to talk, Dr. Ashworth said, his tone carrying the authoritative expectation of compliance she remembered from their academic relationship. There are some developments regarding the Sullivan situation that you need to know about. Elena and Daniel exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension, but uncertain about how to respond to this disruption of their evening routine. Would you prefer to have this conversation privately? Elena offered. Though her protective instincts were clearly activated, Sarah appreciated the support, but realized she needed to face whatever Dr. Ashworth had come to discuss. It's okay. These are people I trust. Dr. Ashworth looked around the rustic interior, with barely concealed disdain before settling into a chair that seemed too small for his imposing frame. The Sullivan documentary premiered last week at the Denver Film Festival. He began without preamble. It's generating significant attention, but not the kind anyone expected. Sarah braced herself for news that the film had been well received, validating the Tribal Council's decision to support the project despite her objections. The film is being critically condemned as exploitative poverty porn, Dr. Ashworth continued. Several prominent Indigenous scholars have written scathing reviews, and there's a growing movement to boycott any distribution deals. Sullivan is facing accusations of ethical violations and cultural appropriation. Sarah felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Being proven right about Sullivan's intentions provided little satisfaction when the damage to her community had already been done. More importantly, Dr. Ashworth added, your recordings of Sullivan's conversations have surfaced. Someone leaked them to native media outlets, and they're being used as evidence of his deceptive practices. Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face, because Dr. Ashworth leaned forward with renewed intensity. Sarah, those recordings are the smoking gun that proves Sullivan deliberately manipulated participants and misrepresented his intentions. They're being hailed as whistleblowing that protected Indigenous communities from further exploitation. I don't understand, Sarah said slowly. I never released those recordings. I couldn't because of the legal agreements Sullivan had everyone sign. Dr. Ashworth smiled for the first time since his arrival. It appears someone else at Pine Ridge had the same concerns you did and made their own recordings. Your documentation provided a template for what to look for and how to gather evidence, even if you couldn't use your own materials. The revelation that someone else had been documenting Sullivan's behavior suggested that Sarah's concerns had been more widely shared than she realized. Her isolated position during the conflict had prevented her from recognizing that other community members were also troubled by the filmmakers' approach. The Tribal Council wants you to know that they're reconsidering the circumstances of your departure, Dr. Ashworth continued. There's growing recognition that your instincts about Sullivan were accurate and that your methods, while problematic, were motivated by legitimate concerns for community welfare. Sarah felt a wave of emotions she couldn't immediately process. The possibility of reconciliation with Pine Ridge was something she had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect so soon. Are they asking me to come back? She asked carefully. Not exactly, Dr. Ashworth admitted. The situation is still complicated, and there are people who remain upset about the divisions the Sullivan conflict created. But there's interest in eventually rebuilding the relationship if you're open to it. Sarah looked around the comfortable room where she had been developing new approaches to Indigenous education. Considering the life she was building at Mountain Heart Community, The possibility of returning to Pine Ridge was appealing, but it would mean abandoning work that felt more meaningful than anything she had done previously. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make any decisions about Pine Ridge," Sarah said finally. "I've committed to spending a year here, and I'm just beginning to understand what that means." Dr. Ashworth's expression shifted to one of puzzlement and slight disapproval. "Sarah, this is an opportunity to restore your professional reputation and return to serious academic work. Living in an intentional community might be personally fulfilling, but it's not going to advance your career or contribute to the broader field of Indigenous studies." The criticism stung because it echoed doubts Sarah sometimes had about whether her current work was as significant as her previous academic pursuits. Dr. Ashworth represented the world of universities, conferences, and peer-reviewed publications where professional success was measured by conventional metrics. Elena spoke up before Sarah could respond. "With respect, Dr. Ashworth, Sarah is doing groundbreaking work in Indigenous education here. She's developing integrated curricula that could serve as models for other communities, trying to balance cultural preservation with contemporary educational requirements." "That's all very nice," Dr. Ashworth replied dismissively, "but it's not scalable or replicable in ways that would have broader impact. Sarah has the potential to influence Indigenous education policy at state and federal levels, but only if she's working within recognized institutional frameworks." The conversation continued for another hour, with Dr. Ashworth presenting arguments for why Sarah should return to conventional academic career paths, and Elena defending the value and significance of community-based educational work. Sarah found herself caught between two worldviews that seemed increasingly incompatible after Dr. Ashworth finally departed. Promising to maintain contact while Sarah considered her options, Elena and Daniel sat with her by the fire as she processed the evening's revelations. "How do you feel about the possibility of reconciliation with Pine Ridge?" Elena asked gently. "Relieved that people are beginning to understand what I was trying to do," Sarah admitted, "but also confused about whether going back would be moving forward or backward." Daniel poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Sometimes the most important question isn't whether you can return to where you came from, but whether you want to." Over the next few days, Sarah found herself distracted from her usual work as she grappled with Dr. Ashworth's visit and its implications. The vindication regarding the Sullivan documentary felt good, but it also highlighted how much her priorities had shifted since arriving at Mountain Heart. The academic world Dr. Ashworth represented had once been her primary source of identity and ambition. Now it seemed increasingly distant from the kind of work that felt meaningful and impactful. The integrated educational approaches she was developing at Mountain Heart might not generate peer-reviewed publications, but they were directly improving the lives of Indigenous children and families. Sarah's internal struggle was complicated by a new challenge that emerged the following week. The State Education Department announced plans to conduct a comprehensive review of alternative education programs, including homeschooling cooperatives like Mountain Heart School. The review would evaluate whether these programs were meeting state standards and providing adequate preparation for standardized assessments. "This could be a serious problem," Rebecca explained during an emergency community meeting. "If they decide our program doesn't meet their requirements, they could force us to either dramatically change our approach or send our kids to conventional schools." Joseph Bearcloud, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, finally spoke up. "What would it take to satisfy their requirements while preserving what makes our program special?" All eyes turned to Sarah, who had become the community's expert on navigating the intersection between Indigenous educational values and state regulatory frameworks. "We'd need to demonstrate that our students are meeting or exceeding state learning standards, even though we're using different pedagogical approaches," Sarah explained. That means more systematic documentation, more structured assessment, and probably some modifications to ensure we're covering all required curriculum areas. Can that be done without destroying what we've built? Elena asked. Sarah had been considering exactly that question since the state review was announced. I think so, but it would require significant work and some compromises. We'd need to develop more formal assessment tools, create better documentation systems, and probably add some conventional instruction methods for areas where our integrated approach isn't sufficient. Over the next several weeks, Sarah threw herself into preparing for the state review with an intensity that surprised even her. She developed comprehensive documentation of student learning outcomes, created alignment charts showing how their integrated curricula met state standards, and designed assessment tools that could demonstrate academic progress while respecting indigenous learning styles. The work was exhausting, but also exhilarating. Sarah realized she was combining her academic training with her community experience to create something genuinely innovative. The educational program she was documenting wasn't just culturally appropriate Indigenous education. It was a model that could demonstrate how alternative pedagogical approaches could meet or exceed conventional academic standards. Margaret Stormcloud visited during this intense preparation period, offering both assistance and perspective on what Sarah was accomplishing. "You're doing something remarkable here," Margaret observed as they reviewed student portfolios and assessment data. "This level of systematic documentation of Indigenous education outcomes is unprecedented. You're not just serving this community, you're creating resources that could benefit Indigenous communities nationwide." The validation from someone with Margaret's expertise meant more to Sarah than Dr. Ashworth's academic credentials ever had. Margaret understood both the cultural and educational significance of what was being developed at Mountain Heart. When the state review team arrived in late spring, Sarah felt as prepared as possible given the circumstances. The reviewers spent 2 days observing classes, interviewing students and teachers, and examining the documentation Sarah had prepared. The lead reviewer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wilson, seemed genuinely impressed by what she observed. "I've never seen such comprehensive integration of cultural content with academic standards," she told Sarah during their final interview. "Your students are clearly engaged and learning, and your documentation demonstrates academic progress that exceeds many conventional programs." Dr. Wilson's preliminary feedback suggested that Mountain Heart's educational program would receive state approval, but she also had recommendations for areas that could be strengthened further. "Have you considered presenting this work at educational conferences?" Dr. Wilson asked. "What you've developed here could serve as a model for other alternative education programs, particularly those serving Indigenous communities." The suggestion resonated with Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. The possibility of sharing Mountain Heart's approaches with other communities represented a different kind of scalability than Dr. Ashworth had promoted, one that honored community autonomy while facilitating knowledge sharing among Indigenous educators. That evening, as the community celebrated the successful completion of the state review, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much her understanding of meaningful work had evolved since her arrival at Mountain Heart. The academic recognition she had once craved seemed less important than the practical impact she was having on students and families. Elena joined her on the porch as the celebration continued inside. "You look thoughtful for someone who just achieved a major victory." "I'm thinking about Dr. Ashworth's visit and Dr. Wilson's suggestions," Sarah admitted, "about different ways of contributing to Indigenous education and what kinds of impact matter most. Have you reached any conclusions?" Sarah watched the stars emerging in the clear mountain sky, feeling more settled in her identity than she had in years. "I think I'm beginning to understand that meaningful work isn't about choosing between community impact and broader influence. It's about finding ways to serve communities while sharing knowledge that can benefit other communities facing similar challenges. The conversation continued late into the evening as Sarah articulated a vision for her future that honored both her commitment to Mountain Heart and her desire to contribute to Indigenous education more broadly. She was beginning to see possibilities she hadn't previously considered, ways of being both a community member and an educator whose work could have regional and national impact. As spring turned toward summer, Sarah felt more confident about her decision to stay at Mountain Heart for the full year she had committed to. The challenges and successes of developing the educational program had taught her valuable lessons about her own capabilities and values, while the community's acceptance had provided a foundation for rebuilding her professional identity on her own terms. Summer at Mountain Heart brought an unexpected influx of visitors. Word of the community's successful state education review had spread through Indigenous networks across the region, and educators from other tribal communities began arriving to observe their integrated curriculum model firsthand. Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar role of hosting delegations and explaining pedagogical approaches she was still developing herself. The first major group arrived in mid-June. 5 educators from the Crow Nation in Montana, led by a woman named Dr. Susan Pretty Eagle, who had heard about Mountain Heart's work through Margaret Stormcloud's professional networks. Sarah had prepared extensively for their visit, organizing classroom observations, curriculum demonstrations, and detailed discussions of assessment strategies. What she hadn't prepared for was how personally rewarding it would be to share knowledge with people who understood both the challenges and the possibilities of Indigenous education. Dr. Pretty Eagle and her colleagues asked sophisticated questions about cultural integration, student engagement, and community involvement that pushed Sarah to articulate aspects of their approach she hadn't fully recognized herself. The key insight seems to be that you're not trying to add Indigenous content to Western educational structures, Dr. Pretty Eagle observed during their final discussion session. You're creating genuinely Indigenous structures that happen to meet Western standards. The distinction resonated deeply with Sarah, who realized that Dr. Pretty Eagle had identified something essential about what made Mountain Heart's approach different from other Indigenous education initiatives she had encountered. Exactly, Sarah replied, feeling excited by the clarity this observation brought to her thinking. We started with traditional learning approaches, observation, hands-on experience, community participation, storytelling, and then figured out how to document and assess those approaches in ways that satisfy state requirements. Dr. Pretty Eagle's team spent the remainder of their visit developing adaptation plans for their own communities, working with Sarah to identify which elements of Mountain Heart's model could be transferred and which would need to be modified for different cultural contexts and regulatory environments. The collaborative planning process taught Sarah valuable lessons about the complexity of scaling educational innovations across diverse Indigenous communities. What worked for Lakota children in the Black Hills might not be appropriate for Crow children in Montana, but the underlying principles of starting with traditional pedagogies and adapting to contemporary requirements seemed broadly applicable. 2 weeks after the Crow Nation educators departed, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would challenge her growing confidence in new ways. The caller identified himself as Dr. James Morrison from the National Science Foundation, explaining that he had learned about Mountain Heart's educational program through Dr. Patricia Wilson's review report. We're interested in funding a research project that would document your integrated STEM education approaches, Dr. Morrison explained. The preliminary data we've seen suggests your students are achieving remarkable outcomes in science and mathematics, despite using non-traditional instructional methods. Sarah felt simultaneously excited and wary about the proposal. Federal funding would provide resources to expand and improve their educational programming, but it would also bring oversight, reporting requirements, and pressure to produce results that could be quantified and published. "What kind of research are you envisioning?" Sarah asked carefully. "A 3-year longitudinal study comparing learning outcomes between your integrated approach and conventional STEM instruction," Dr. Morrison replied. "We'd want to track student progress, document pedagogical methods, and analyze the effectiveness of traditional ecological knowledge integration in science education." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Dr. Morrison outlining the potential scope and benefits of the proposed research. Sarah found herself torn between excitement about the validation and resources federal funding would provide, and concern about how research requirements might alter the community-centered focus that made their approach effective. After ending the call, Sarah immediately sought out Elena and Daniel to discuss the proposal and its implications. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," Elena said thoughtfully. "But I'm worried about how research requirements might change what we're doing. Once you start having to produce data for federal funders, it becomes harder to maintain focus on what's best for our kids and families." Daniel nodded in agreement. "We've seen other communities get caught up in grant requirements that gradually shifted their programs away from their original values and goals." Sarah understood their concerns, which echoed her own mixed feelings about the proposal. The NSF funding would provide resources they desperately needed, but it would also transform their grassroots educational experiment into a federally funded research project with all the complications that entailed. "What if we approached it differently?" Sarah suggested after considering the dilemma. "What if we used the research framework to document what we're already doing, rather than changing what we do to fit research requirements?" The discussion continued over several days, involving other community members and ultimately leading to a consensus that Sarah should explore the NSF proposal further while maintaining clear boundaries about community autonomy and educational priorities. Sarah spent the next month developing a research proposal that would satisfy federal requirements while protecting Mountain Heart's community-centered approach. The process required her to articulate their educational philosophy and methods more systematically than she had ever done before, creating documentation that proved valuable even beyond the grant application. During this intensive writing period, Sarah received another unexpected visitor. Her sister Jennifer arrived unannounced one afternoon, driving the same pickup truck Sarah remembered from childhood, but looking older and more worn than Sarah had expected. "I needed to see where you've been living," Jennifer explained, as Sarah showed her around the community grounds. "And I wanted to talk with you about some things that have been happening at Pine Ridge." The conversation that followed revealed that the aftermath of the Sullivan documentary had created more changes at Pine Ridge than Dr. Ashworth had indicated. Several tribal council members had resigned in the face of community criticism about their support for the exploitative project, and new leadership was emerging that was more focused on cultural preservation and community self-determination. "People are asking different questions now," Jennifer explained as they sat in Sarah's small residence. "Questions about how we make decisions, who we trust, and what kinds of outside partnerships really serve our community." Sarah listened carefully, sensing that her sister was building toward something specific. "The new council wants to develop better processes for evaluating projects and partnerships before agreeing to them," Jennifer continued. "They're looking for someone with experience in both traditional knowledge and contemporary research methods to help design those processes." The implication was clear, though Jennifer didn't state it directly. Pine Ridge was considering asking Sarah to return in a consulting capacity, helping them develop the kind of critical evaluation skills that might have prevented the Sullivan situation from occurring. "Are you asking me to come back?" Sarah asked directly. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider it, Jennifer replied. Not permanently, necessarily, but as a way of contributing to changes that your experience helped make possible. Sarah felt the familiar tension between competing loyalties and opportunities. Her work at Mountain Heart was reaching a critical phase, with the NSF proposal under consideration and several other communities requesting assistance with their own educational programs. Returning to Pine Ridge, even temporarily, would mean stepping back into the complicated family and tribal dynamics she had been healing from. I need time to think about it, Sarah said finally. My commitment here runs through the end of the year, and I'm not sure I'm ready to navigate Pine Ridge politics again. Jennifer nodded understandingly. I'm not trying to pressure you. I just wanted you to know that there's space for reconciliation if you decide you want it. The conversation with her sister forced Sarah to confront questions about her long-term future that she had been avoiding. Her year at Mountain Heart was more than half over, and she would soon need to decide whether to make the arrangement permanent or explore other possibilities. That evening, Sarah walked the mountain trails surrounding the community, using the physical movement to process the emotional complexity of her sister's visit. The landscape that had seemed alien and intimidating during her first blizzard-driven arrival now felt familiar and comforting. She knew which paths led to the best viewpoints, where to find seasonal berries, and how to read weather patterns in the cloud formations over distant peaks. Mountain Heart had become home in ways Sarah hadn't expected when she agreed to stay for a year. The community members were no longer helpful strangers, but genuine friends and colleagues whose daily lives were intertwined with her own. The educational work she was doing felt more meaningful and impactful than anything she had accomplished in her previous academic career. Yet, Jennifer's visit had reminded her that healing her relationship with Pine Ridge remained unfinished business. The community that had shaped her identity for 32 years deserved more than her continued absence, especially if her experience and skills could contribute to positive changes. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by the sound of voices approaching on the trail. Elena and Rebecca appeared around a bend, carrying day packs and looking like they had been hiking for several hours. "Mind if we join you?" Elena called out as they approached. Sarah welcomed the company, realizing she had been walking for nearly 2 hours without paying attention to time or distance. The three women settled on a rocky outcropping with views across the valley where Mountain Heart's buildings nestled among the trees. Jennifer told me about the Pine Ridge situation before she left. Eleanor said without preamble, "How are you feeling about the possibility of reconciliation?" Sarah appreciated Elena's direct approach, which saved her from having to figure out how to introduce the topic herself. "Conflicted," Sarah admitted. "Part of me wants to contribute to positive changes at Pine Ridge, but part of me is afraid of getting pulled back into dynamics that were destructive for me." Rebecca, who rarely involved herself in personal conversations, surprised Sarah by offering her perspective. "You're not the same person who left Pine Ridge 8 months ago," Rebecca observed. "You've developed skills and confidence here that might let you engage with those dynamics differently." The insight was perceptive and encouraging. Sarah realized that her time at Mountain Heart had indeed changed her in fundamental ways. She was more confident in her professional abilities, more skilled at collaborative decision-making, and less dependent on external validation for her sense of worth. "What would it look like if you said yes to both opportunities?" Elena asked. "Pine Ridge Consulting and continued work here." Sarah had been so focused on seeing the opportunities as mutually exclusive that she hadn't seriously considered whether they might be complementary. "I don't know if that's possible," Sarah replied. "Both situations would require significant time and energy." "Maybe," Elena acknowledged, "but you've proven you can manage complex projects and multiple relationships, and both opportunities are focused on Indigenous education and community development. There might be more synergy than conflict." The conversation continued as evening light began fading across the mountains. By the time they returned to the main community buildings, Sarah had begun sketching out possibilities for integrating her various opportunities rather than choosing between them. Over the next several days, Sarah developed a proposal that would allow her to maintain her residence and primary work at Mountain Heart while taking on periodic consulting projects with Pine Ridge and other indigenous communities. The NSF research grant, if funded, would provide a framework for documenting and sharing educational innovations across multiple communities. The proposal required careful negotiation with all parties involved, but Sarah found that her year of community-based collaboration had prepared her well for managing complex stakeholder relationships. Mountain Heart's leadership supported her expanded role as long as it didn't compromise her commitment to their educational program. Pine Ridge's new council was interested in accessing her expertise without demanding exclusive commitment. The NSF program officers were enthusiastic about research that would span multiple indigenous communities and educational contexts. By late summer, Sarah had established a professional identity that integrated all her various commitments and interests. She would continue living at Mountain Heart and directing their educational program, while also conducting research funded by the NSF grant and providing consulting services to other indigenous communities working on similar initiatives. The arrangement felt both ambitious and sustainable, building on the foundation of community membership she had established at Mountain Heart while extending her influence and impact across a broader network of indigenous educators and communities. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since her exile from Pine Ridge, Sarah realized that her crisis had ultimately led to opportunities she never would have pursued under different circumstances. The forced departure from familiar structures and relationships had created space for discovering capacities and interests she hadn't previously recognized. The woman who had been cast out in winter had become someone whose fire burned not just for one community, but for the broader project of strengthening indigenous education and cultural preservation across multiple communities and contexts. Her exile had become a form of expansion rather than limitation, creating possibilities for service and impact that transcended the boundaries of any single tribal community. Standing on the same mountain trail where she had processed Jennifer's visit months earlier, Sarah felt grateful for the painful journey that had led to this unexpected destination. The fire that had sustained her through the storm was now burning more brightly than ever, warming not just her own life, but contributing light and heat to the broader indigenous educational community she had discovered and helped to build. The invitation arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah had been cast out from Pine Ridge. The envelope bore the official seal of the Lakota Tribal Council, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of her nephew David, now a freshman at Black Hills State University, studying communications and indigenous media. "Aunt Sarah," the letter began, "the council has asked me to invite you to speak at our annual Education Summit next month. The theme is Learning from Crisis, Building Stronger Educational Foundations. They specifically want you to present the work you've been doing at Mountain Heart and with other communities. Uncle Robert says it's time for healing and learning to happen together." Sarah read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing different layers of significance. The formal invitation represented official recognition of her expertise and a step toward reconciliation. David's involvement suggested that younger community members were taking leadership roles in bridging the divisions the Sullivan controversy had created. Most importantly, the summit's theme indicated that Pine Ridge was approaching their recent difficulties as learning opportunities rather than failures to be forgotten. Elena found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with the letter spread before her, staring out at the autumn landscape of Mountain Heart, where golden aspens created brilliant patches of color against the darker evergreens. "Good news or challenging news?" Elena asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah with her morning coffee. Both, Sarah replied, sliding the invitation across the table. Pine Ridge wants me to present at their education summit. Elena read the letter carefully before responding. How does that feel? Sarah had been asking herself the same question since opening the envelope. The invitation represented everything she had hoped for during the dark months following her exile: recognition, reconciliation, and the opportunity to contribute to her home community's educational development. Yet she also felt nervous about returning to the complicated dynamics and family relationships she had spent a year learning to navigate from a distance. Scary, Sarah admitted, but also right somehow, like a circle that needs to be completed. Over the next few days, Sarah began preparing for what she knew would be one of the most important presentations of her career. This wouldn't be an academic conference where success was measured by intellectual rigor and peer approval. This would be a homecoming where personal relationships, community healing, and practical educational improvement were all at stake. Sarah decided to structure her presentation around the concept of educational sovereignty, the idea that indigenous communities could meet contemporary educational requirements while maintaining control over pedagogical approaches and cultural content. Her year at Mountain Heart had provided concrete examples of how this principle could be implemented, while her consulting work with other communities had demonstrated its broader applicability. The week before the summit, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Marcus Sullivan. She almost didn't answer when she saw the unfamiliar Los Angeles area code, but something prompted her to pick up. "Sarah, this is Marcus Sullivan," the voice that had haunted her thoughts for over a year said without preamble. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize before you hear about my new project." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The idea that Sullivan was planning another documentary involving indigenous communities filled her with the same protective anger that had motivated her original opposition to his Pine Ridge project. "What kind of project?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Actually, it's about what happened with the Pine Ridge documentary," Sullivan explained. "I'm making a film about my own failures and the harm that well-intentioned but ignorant outsiders can do to indigenous communities. I want to use my experience as a cautionary tale about cultural appropriation and exploitative documentary practices." Sarah was too stunned to respond immediately. The idea of Sullivan making himself the subject of critical analysis was so unexpected that she couldn't immediately process its implications. "I'm not asking for your participation or endorsement," Sullivan continued, "but I wanted you to know that the recordings you made, which eventually became public, taught me things about my own behavior and assumptions that I needed to learn. The film is my attempt to take responsibility for the harm I caused and maybe prevent other filmmakers from making similar mistakes." The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Sullivan describing his plans for a documentary that would examine the ethics of cross-cultural filmmaking and the responsibility of documentary makers to the communities they portray. Sarah found herself cautiously impressed by what seemed like genuine self-reflection and commitment to making amends. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Sullivan concluded. "I'm asking for you to know that your resistance to my project, which I initially saw as obstruction, actually served exactly the protective function you intended. The Pine Ridge community is stronger for having people like you who are willing to stand up to exploitation, even when it's costly." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her small residence processing this unexpected development. Sullivan's acknowledgement of her protective motivations provided a form of closure she hadn't realized she needed. More importantly, his commitment to public self-examination suggested that the Pine Ridge crisis might ultimately contribute to better practices among documentary filmmakers. Working with indigenous communities. 3 days before the education summit, Sarah drove her truck back toward Pine Ridge for the first time since her exile. The familiar landscape looked different in autumn light than it had during the blizzard that marked her departure. but every landmark triggered memories of her childhood and young adulthood in the community that had shaped her identity. She had arranged to stay with Margaret Stormcloud rather than with family members, wanting to maintain some emotional distance while she navigated the complicated process of returning home. Margaret's house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge provided a quiet space for final preparation and gradual reintegration into community life. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Margaret asked as they reviewed Sarah's presentation materials the evening before the summit. "Like I'm about to find out whether I've actually grown and changed as much as I think I have," Sarah replied honestly. The Education Summit was held at the Tribal College, in the same auditorium where Sarah had attended countless community events over the years. As she set up her presentation materials, Sarah recognized many faces in the gathering crowd: former colleagues, family members, community leaders, and parents of her former students. The reception was warmer than she had dared to hope. People approached to welcome her back, express interest in her work at Mountain Heart, and share updates about their own lives and families. The conversations felt genuine rather than obligatory, suggesting that the community had indeed moved toward healing rather than holding grudges. Chairman Robert Blackhorse, who had delivered the verdict of her exile a year earlier, introduced her presentation with words that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah Whitehorse left our community during a difficult time, when we were struggling with questions about how to protect our people while remaining open to outside partnerships," he began. "A year away has allowed both Sarah and our community to learn and grow. Today, she returns as a teacher whose experience can help us build stronger educational foundations for our children." Sarah's presentation went better than she had imagined possible. The audience was engaged and asked thoughtful questions about practical implementation of educational sovereignty principles. Parents wanted to know how integrated curricula could serve their children's needs. Educators were interested in assessment strategies and state compliance requirements. Community leaders asked about funding sources and partnership opportunities. Most importantly, the questions and comments suggested that Pine Ridge was ready to implement some of the approaches Sarah had been developing. The community had used their crisis with the Sullivan documentary as a catalyst for examining their educational practices and decision-making processes more critically. During the lunch break, David approached Sarah with obvious pride and excitement. "Aunt Sarah, I've been documenting the summit for our tribal media program," he explained. "Would you be willing to do an interview about your journey and what you've learned?" The request represented a form of redemption that Sarah found deeply moving. David was using the media skills he was developing in college to serve his community's educational goals, demonstrating exactly the kind of indigenous media sovereignty that Sarah's resistance to the Sullivan documentary had been trying to protect. The interview took place in a quiet corner of the college library, with David operating a professional quality video camera and asking questions that revealed both his journalistic training and his personal understanding of the family dynamics surrounding Sarah's exile and return. "What would you say to other indigenous people who are struggling with conflicts between community loyalty and individual conscience?" David asked toward the end of their conversation. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about everything she had learned during her year of exile and rebuilding. "I would say that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your community is to step away when staying would create more harm than healing," she replied. "But I would also say that stepping away doesn't have to mean permanent separation. Growth and healing can create new possibilities for service and connection that weren't available before the crisis." That afternoon's sessions focused on practical implementation of the ideas Sarah had presented. Working groups formed around different aspects of educational development: curriculum integration, assessment strategies, community partnerships, and teacher professional development. Sarah found herself moving between groups as a consultant and facilitator, helping community members develop specific plans for improving their educational programs. The collaborative planning process reminded Sarah of the collective decision-making approaches she had learned at Mountain Heart, but adapted to Pine Ridge's specific cultural context and community structure. She realized that her year away had given her skills and perspectives that were serving her home community in ways that wouldn't have been possible if she had never left. During the summit's closing session, Elder Thomas Crowfeather asked to speak directly to Sarah. Sarah Whitehorse, you were asked to leave our community because your actions, however well-intentioned, were creating division among our people, the elder said. Is weathered face serious but not unkind? Today, your knowledge and experience have served our unity and educational goals. This suggests that the time of separation has served its purpose for both you and our community. The elder's words carried the weight of formal reconciliation, indicating that Sarah's exile was officially ended and her standing in the community restored. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, suggesting broad community support for her return to good standing. That evening, Sarah joined her extended family for dinner at her sister Jennifer's house. The gathering included cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had been part of Sarah's life since childhood. The conversation was easier than she had expected, with people expressing genuine interest in her experiences at Mountain Heart and pride in her professional achievements. "So, are you coming home to stay?" her cousin Michael asked directly. Sarah had been anticipating this question throughout the day. Her presentation had been well received, her reconciliation with the community was complete, and opportunities for meaningful work at Pine Ridge were clearly available. "I'm coming home in the sense that Pine Ridge will always be home," Sarah replied carefully. "But I'm not moving back permanently. My life and work at Mountain Heart are too important to abandon. And I think I can serve this community better as someone who brings outside experiences and perspectives to our challenges." The response seemed to satisfy most family members, who understood that Sarah's expanded identity and capabilities were assets to be shared, rather than possessions to be reclaimed. Later that evening, Sarah walked alone through the streets of Pine Ridge, where she had grown up. The familiar landmarks looked the same, but her relationship to them had been fundamentally altered by her year of exile and growth. She felt deep affection for this place and its people, but no longer felt defined or constrained by their expectations and assumptions. The next morning, Sarah attended a private meeting with the Tribal Council to discuss ongoing collaboration between Pine Ridge and the network of indigenous educational innovators she had been building. The council was interested in hosting future conferences, establishing exchange programs with other communities, and accessing the federal funding opportunities Sarah's research had identified. The meeting felt like a professional consultation rather than a personal reconciliation, which indicated how much both Sarah and the community had matured since the crisis that led to her departure. They were now able to separate personal relationships from community business in ways that served everyone's interests more effectively. As Sarah prepared to return to Mountain Heart that afternoon, she realized that her exile had achieved exactly what Elder Crowfeather had hoped when he delivered the original verdict. The time of separation had allowed both Sarah and Pine Ridge to grow and change in ways that made their relationship stronger and more productive than it had been before the crisis. She was no longer Sarah Whitehorse of Pine Ridge, defined primarily by her tribal membership and family relationships. She'd become Sarah Whitehorse the educator, the consultant, the bridge builder between communities who happened to have deep roots in Pine Ridge and ongoing commitments to its educational development. Driving back toward the Black Hills, as autumn light painted the landscape in brilliant colors, Sarah felt the completion of a circle that had begun with her desperate departure in a winter storm. The woman who had been cast out because of her uncompromising principles had returned as a teacher whose exile had equipped her to serve not just one community, but a network of indigenous communities working toward educational sovereignty and cultural preservation. The fire that had sustained her through the darkest months of isolation was now burning more brightly than ever, warming and illuminating not just her own path, but creating light that other indigenous educators and communities could use to navigate their own challenges and opportunities. 2 years later, Sarah stood before an audience of 300 Indigenous educators at the first National Indigenous Educational Sovereignty Conference held at the University of Colorado, Denver. The conference had grown from a conversation between Sarah and colleagues who recognized the need for a dedicated space where Indigenous communities could share innovative educational practices without having to justify their cultural approaches to non-native academics or policy makers. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as educators from over 50 tribal communities across North America gathered to learn from each other's successes and challenges. Sarah could see familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd: Elena and Daniel from Mountain Heart, Dr. Susan Pretty Eagle from the Crow Nation, Margaret Stormcloud from Pine Ridge, and dozens of other educators she had worked with over the past 2 years. 3 years ago, I was cast out from my home community for trying to protect them from exploitation, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. Today, I stand before you as proof that exile can become expansion, crisis can become catalyst, and individual struggle can become collective strength. The presentation that followed traced the journey from her desperate winter departure from Pine Ridge to the thriving network of Indigenous educational innovators that now spanned the continent. Sarah shared data from the NSF research project that had documented remarkable learning outcomes across multiple communities using integrated curricula and traditional pedagogical approaches. She presented case studies showing how communities had successfully navigated state requirements while maintaining cultural integrity. Most importantly, she celebrated the educators and community leaders who had transformed their local educational systems through collaborative innovation and mutual support. During the question and answer session, a young Navajo teacher from Arizona stood to address Sarah directly. Dr. Whitehorse, your work has inspired many of us to take risks in our own communities. But some of us are facing resistance similar to what you experienced at Pine Ridge. How do we balance individual conscience with community loyalty when they seem to conflict? Sarah paused, remembering her own struggles with that exact question during the Sullivan documentary crisis. The most important thing I learned is that individual conscience and community loyalty don't have to be in opposition, Sarah replied. But serving your community sometimes requires expanding your understanding of what community means. When I was fighting the exploitative documentary, I thought my community was just Pine Ridge, but my real community includes all Indigenous people who are working to protect our children and preserve our cultures. She gestured toward the diverse audience filling the auditorium. Every person in this room is part of my community now, and my loyalty extends to all of you. Sometimes serving this larger community means taking stands that create temporary conflicts with smaller communities. But the goal is always healing and strengthening our collective ability to educate our children according to our own values. The answer seemed to resonate with many audience members, several of whom nodded in recognition of similar struggles in their own experience. That evening's banquet featured a keynote address from Dr. Vine Deloria Jr.'s daughter, who spoke about the evolution of Indigenous intellectual sovereignty and the role of education in cultural survival. During her remarks, she specifically acknowledged Sarah's work in creating models for educational practice that honored both traditional knowledge and contemporary requirements. Sarah Whitehorse represents a new generation of Indigenous educators who refuse to accept that we must choose between cultural authenticity and academic excellence, the keynote speaker observed. Her journey from exile to leadership demonstrates that our most difficult challenges can become our greatest opportunities for service. After the banquet, Sarah joined a smaller gathering of conference organizers and key presenters for an informal planning session about the following year's conference. The conversation ranged from practical logistics to broader questions about the future of Indigenous education and the role of conferences like this in supporting community-based innovation. Margaret Stormcloud, who had been elected to the conference planning committee, raised a question that had been on several people's minds. We've focused primarily on K-12 education so far, but what about higher education? How do we support Indigenous students who want to pursue advanced degrees while maintaining connections to their communities and cultures? Sarah had been wrestling with exactly that question in her own life. Her work had gained sufficient recognition that several universities had approached her about faculty positions, offering the kind of academic career she had once dreamed of pursuing. But the prospect of returning to institutional academic life, even as a tenured professor with significant autonomy, felt like a step backward from the community-based work that had become her passion. I think we need to develop new models for advanced Indigenous education, Sarah replied. Models that don't require people to leave their communities or abandon their cultural connections in order to develop expertise and leadership. Capacity. The conversation that followed explored possibilities for distributed graduate programs, community-based research initiatives, and alternative credentialing systems that could serve Indigenous scholars who wanted to contribute to their communities rather than primarily to academic disciplines. Elena, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up with a suggestion that surprised everyone. What if Mountain Heart offered to host an experimental graduate program in Indigenous educational leadership? We have the infrastructure, the community partnerships, and now the track record to attract both students and faculty who want to try something different. The idea energized the group, sparking discussions about curriculum design, accreditation requirements, and funding strategies that continued well into the night. Sarah found herself imagining possibilities for graduate education that would be rooted in community practice rather than academic theory, producing Indigenous leaders who were equipped to serve tribal communities rather than primarily advance their own careers. Over the next several months, Sarah worked with Elena and other colleagues to develop a proposal for what they called the Indigenous Educational Leadership Institute. The program would offer master's and doctoral degrees through a partnership with a sympathetic university. But the actual learning would take place in Indigenous communities across the region. Students would spend time in multiple communities, learning different approaches to educational sovereignty while contributing to ongoing projects and research. Faculty would include both credentialed academics and traditional knowledge holders from participating communities. The curriculum would integrate policy analysis, curriculum development, cultural preservation, and community organizing skills. Most importantly, graduates would be expected to return to their home communities or work with other Indigenous communities rather than pursue conventional academic careers. The program's success would be measured by the impact graduates had on Indigenous educational outcomes rather than by their publications or professional advancement. The proposal process required Sarah to navigate complex negotiations with university administrators, federal funding agencies, and tribal government officials. She drew on all the relationship-building skills she had developed during her community-based work. But the scale and complexity of establishing a new graduate program tested her abilities in new ways. 6 months after the Denver conference, Sarah received notification that their proposal had been selected for a major federal grant that would fund the Indigenous Educational Leadership Institute for 5 years. The news came on the same day that Marcus Sullivan's documentary about his own failures and the ethics of cross-cultural filmmaking premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, earning positive reviews for its honest self-examination and thoughtful analysis of power dynamics in documentary production. Sarah watched Sullivan's film at the Tribal College in Pine Ridge, surrounded by community members who had lived through the original controversy. The film included interview footage with several Pine Ridge residents, including Sarah's sister Jennifer and nephew David, who discussed how the community had learned and grown from the experience. Sarah herself had declined to be interviewed for Sullivan's film, but her influence was evident throughout the documentary. Sullivan repeatedly referenced the educator, who tried to warn us and acknowledged that her resistance had been exactly the kind of protective advocacy that Indigenous communities needed when dealing with outside media attention. I initially saw her as an obstacle to my artistic vision, Sullivan admitted in the film's final segment. But I now understand that she was serving exactly the function that someone in her position should serve, protecting her community from exploitation and holding outsiders accountable for their impact on Indigenous people. The film's reception at Pine Ridge was cautiously positive, with community members appreciating Sullivan's acknowledgement of his mistakes while remaining skeptical about his motivations for making such a public confession. Sarah found herself feeling neutral about the filmmaker's redemption narrative, more focused on the positive changes that had emerged from the crisis than on Sullivan's personal journey toward greater cultural sensitivity. The launch of the Indigenous Educational Leadership Institute coincided with Sarah's third anniversary at Mountain Heart Community. What had begun as temporary refuge from exile had evolved into the foundation for a career that spanned multiple communities and served Indigenous educational sovereignty. At a national level, Sarah's daily life now included responsibilities she couldn't have imagined during her desperate flight from Pine Ridge. She was directing the new graduate program, consulting with communities across the country, conducting research on Indigenous pedagogical approaches, and writing articles for both academic journals and tribal newspapers. Yet despite the complexity and reach of her professional responsibilities, Sarah maintained the community-centered focus that had initially drawn her to Mountain Heart. She still taught at the community school, still participated in collective decision-making processes, and still drew her primary sense of identity from her relationships with the people who shared her daily life. On the anniversary evening of her arrival at Mountain Heart, Sarah climbed the same mountain trail where she had processed so many difficult decisions during her first year in the community. The autumn landscape looked similar to that first fall when she'd been deciding whether to stay or continue her journey into exile. But her perspective on the view had been transformed by everything that had happened since. Elena joined her on the trail, as she had on so many previous occasions when Sarah needed to think through complex decisions or process emotional challenges. "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Elena asked as they reached the rocky outcropping that offered the best views of the community below. Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about all the pain and uncertainty that had preceded the professional satisfaction and personal growth she now experienced. "I regret the harm that was done to people I care about," Sarah replied finally. "I regret that it took a crisis to teach me lessons I might have learned in less painful ways. But I don't regret the journey itself, because it led to work and relationships I wouldn't have discovered otherwise." She gestured toward the lights of Mountain Heart's buildings scattered among the trees, then toward the broader landscape that now represented a network of Indigenous communities she served and learned from. "The fire that burns in our main house has become a metaphor for something larger," Sarah continued. "When Elena first said our fire burns for you during that blizzard, neither of us could have imagined that the warmth and light would eventually reach so many other communities." Elena smiled, remembering that first night when she had opened the door to a desperate stranger seeking refuge from a storm. The best fires are the ones that spread safely, lighting other fires rather than consuming everything around them, Elena observed as they made their way back down the mountain trail in gathering darkness. Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of home and belonging had been transformed. She was no longer Sarah Whitehorse of Pine Ridge, defined primarily by birth community and family relationships. She had become Sarah Whitehorse of the Indigenous Educational Sovereignty Movement, someone whose identity was shaped by service to multiple communities and commitment to collective liberation rather than individual advancement. The woman who had been cast out in winter because of her uncompromising principles had learned to channel those same principles into building bridges rather than defending positions. Her refusal to compromise her values had evolved into an ability to help others find ways to honor their values while navigating complex political and institutional challenges. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that the fire that had sustained her through the darkest period of her exile was not hers alone. It was a flame that burned in Indigenous educators and community leaders across the continent, people who shared her commitment to protecting their children and preserving their cultures in the face of persistent colonization and assimilation pressures. The Indigenous Educational Leadership Institute now had its first cohort of 12 students, representing communities from Alaska to Florida. These emerging leaders would graduate with skills and networks that would allow them to return to their communities as change agents, carrying the fire of educational sovereignty to places where it had not yet been kindled. Standing on the porch of the main house where she had first found refuge, Sarah looked up at stars that seemed brighter than ever in the clear mountain air. The blizzard that had driven her to this door 3 years earlier had long since melted into spring rains that nourished new growth, just as her personal crisis had ultimately nourished a movement that was transforming Indigenous education across North America. The fire that burned for her that first desperate night now burned for thousands of Indigenous children whose education would be shaped by the models and networks that had emerged from her journey through exile and into expanded service. Sarah Whitehorse had found her way home, not by returning to the place she came from, but by helping to create the world where all Indigenous children could learn and grow according to their own people's wisdom and values. In the end, the woman who had been cast out had become the teacher whose fire burned brightest when it was shared, illuminating paths toward educational sovereignty that entire communities could walk together toward futures they defined for themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.